So as you've just seen, there is now a method to spawn upwards of hundreds of goblins using one of the new Nightmare Dungeon nodes for the Warplan system. And this will drop so much loot that it's physically impossible to pick it all up. Once you go back to town and come back, a bunch of the loot will have despawned, even though it seems the game will keep the most valuable loot, like set charms or greater affix items, and it still allows a lot of loot to be there. But that's what I want to go over in this video, because I have actually done this same thing a handful of times now, because you really only need 2 different things to line up for you to actually be able to do this. And you may be wondering what's exactly happening here, and to understand this, you have to first understand the goblin you're going to need for this to work, and that's the Gelatinous Syrus, which is the blue goblin. This is the goblin that splits into smaller ones when you defeat it. So you defeat the main goblin, it'll split into 2. Both of those, when defeated, will split into 3. So it's a total of 9 goblins, and they all spawn the same loot. Just when you're defeating the normal one, they split into smaller goblins. And this goblin seems to drop a mix of a bunch of different loot. They'll drop some resources, they'll drop some pieces of gear, they usually will drop some amount of like keys or other things like that. So they kind of have a mix of loot, they just give you a lot of it. Now when you mix that with the specific Nightmare Dungeon node, you can actually multiply these because of how it works. Now the node you're going to need is called Gauntlet in the Nightmare Dungeon tree. It is on the left side, which are the red nodes. And this reads out, while in a Nightmare Dungeon, slaying an enemy while empowered by a shrine traps their soul within you. When the shrine buff expires, all trapped souls escape and spawn around you as renewed enemies. So essentially what happens, you go get a shrine buff when you're in a Nightmare Dungeon. Any enemy you defeat when you have that shrine buff will then be respawned when the shrine buff ends. This includes goblins, this includes the affixes of elite enemies. So let's say you're in a gilded dungeon where all of the enemies have gilded to drop a bunch of gold. You kill a bunch of those with the shrine buff, they will respawn as that same enemy. You can even respawn the butcher or other elite enemies in dungeons. So when you have a shrine buff, you're basically just duplicating all the enemies you defeat. Well, this works on goblins, and with the Gelatinous Syrus, this works a little bit differently. Because with the Gelatinous Syrus, because all of these smaller goblins that are splitting off for the main one are all still considered goblins and still drop the same loot, when you use this with this shrine buff, and then the shrine buff ends, it will spawn all new Gelatinous Syruses. So you pick up a shrine buff, you kill that Gelatinous Syrus, you kill all 9 of the ones that split off from him, which will give you a total of 9 goblin kills. Well, once that shrine buff ends, it will spawn 9 new Gelatinous Syruses that are all the bigger one. So all 9 of those new ones that just spawned will do the splitting as well. So all 9 of them will in total have 9 total goblins if you can kill them all. And just that first round is absolutely ridiculous. If you only killed that one Gelatinous Syrus within the shrine buff, that's 81 goblins that will now spawn if you could kill them all in that one shrine buff. But as you'll see in some of the footage I'm showing, you can double this with more shrine buffs, and this works for anything in dungeons. You just have to make sure to play it correctly. So how this would work if you would want to double this is you would need to find an area that has a Gelatinous Syrus next to 2 different shrines. So you would go in, pick up the shrine buff, you would kill that Gelatinous Syrus and kill all of his little splits, then you would wait for that shrine buff to fall off you next to the other shrine buff, because right when that shrine buff falls off and it spawns these 9 new goblins, you would then pick up the next shrine buff. You would kill all of the goblins you possibly could out of the total of 81 that you could end up killing. And while you're killing all of that, the other shrine buff is picking up all of the souls from those. So let's say you kill all 81 of those splitting off goblins within that second shrine buff. Well, now it would end up spawning 81 new Gelatinous Syruses that if you could kill them all, it would technically spawn 729 goblins, but I'm not actually sure if the game will even allow this many to actually occur. And even if they do, you might crash your game. I wasn't even able to come close to killing off the goblins because there's also just so much loot that you can't actually see the goblin icon on your minimap anymore. So once you could do this with 2 shrines, you're probably not going to kill all the goblins. You're not going to loot even a small percentage of all of the possible loot of this, but it is is just such a cool experience. I have never seen anywhere in Diablo 4 in the entirety of its history, and I've played and completed every season and the launch of the game. I've never seen anywhere that drops even relatively close to this much loot. You may not be able to see it in the video as well, but this was absolutely crashing my FPS. I was getting small stutters when there was just dozens and dozens of goblins being killed. The goblins themselves don't seem to lag you a ton, but when you kill like a dozen of them at a time and they all spew out loot, that gets pretty laggy. Also, there are other things you can add on top of this to get even more loot if that's what you want, specifically through the Nightmare Dungeon tree. And that's if you go on the right side of the tree and get the blue nodes. The first node on the tree is when you kill a treasure goblin, they have a small chance to drop a Nightmare Sigil with a Treasure Breach affix on it. This will also be really hard to loot when you're doing this, and I'm not sure if Nightmare Sigils are one of the things that the game will save once you leave to go back to town to sell all of your stuff and come back and loot. A bunch of stuff will despawn. I'm not sure if these Nightmare Sigils would be one of the things that would despawn. I think they are actually one of the things that would despawn because they don't have a like higher rarity attached to them. It's just a normal Nightmare Sigil, even though it would have a legendary affix on it. But I did find a couple of these Nightmare Sigils with Treasure Breach affixes on them by doing some Treasure Breach dungeons. So if you're going to be going for this, you'll probably want to have this in general. Then another thing that can mix pretty well with this is the final node on the blue side of the tree, which is Greed is Good. When you kill a treasure goblin in a Nightmare Dungeon, there's a small chance to spawn a new treasure portal or the Goblin's Retreat, which I did also get, and I have footage of, you'll probably see it in this video, where it's essentially like the gold goblin area from Diablo 3. It's just a bunch of goblins and resplendent chests in there. Then there's a boss at the end that also drops a bunch of stuff and spawns more goblins in. And I was again able to get this combination of multiple shrines and the Gelatinous Syrus within this Goblin's Retreat special dungeon. But something to note is this goblin seems to break when leaving it, because I killed hundreds of these goblins within this dungeon from doing this combination again. And when I left and came back, literally all of the loot on the ground was gone. So it seems that within the Goblin's Retreat dungeon, you probably shouldn't really want to do this because you won't be able to loot a ton of stuff. But when you're just in a normal Nightmare Dungeon, a lot of the loot does stay, so you can keep going back to town to loot this. You could also bring these goblins back to town if you wanted to. If you guys haven't seen it yet, people have been doing that with certain mobs because you can actually take the shrine buff, kill a bunch of stuff, and then teleport back to town. And when the shrine buff falls off you, all of those enemies will respawn in town with you. So I don't know, if you want to just do something funny, you can do that. And I don't even think players can actually attack these enemies, so you could just spawn a bunch of different goblins here for no reason. But this combination is just really cool to pull off. And if you could do it, even though a bunch of loot despawns, I was still able to loot probably upwards of like 100 plus greater affix items, because those seem to be the items that the game wasn't despawning. And I was able to loot like over a dozen full inventory of charm items. It seemed to keep all of the unique and set charms over everything else. So I legitimately just looted hundreds and hundreds of like set and unique charms from doing just one of these interactions. So even though you're going to lose a lot of loot from doing this, you're still going to gain more loot than you could ever possibly do through other methods. So you'll legitimately go through this interaction and do it in like 5 minutes, and then you'll spend the next like 10-15 minutes literally just spam looting stuff and going back to town. This will be much better if you have a much more strict loot filter on. Mine wasn't as strict as it should have been here, and since then I made it more strict, and it would probably make doing this significantly better because I would really only be seeing the loot I want to see. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to despawn the loot. It would just let you pick through your first inventory much more cleanly before going back and having things despawn. Because even if you have a loot filter on, it will despawn the physical items on the ground. Because even if you have a loot filter on, you can still physically see the items that are dropped on the ground. You just can't see like their pop up and their loot beam, but they're still there, and the game will still depopulate and despawn those items when there's too many of them. So it's still going to despawn stuff, but if you have a more strict loot filter, it should just make looting when doing this interaction much more easy. Now, the main way you're actually going to find this interaction is through Treasure Breach Nightmare Dungeons, and there's really two ways to go about this. You just farm things that give you either Sigil Dust or Nightmare Dungeon keys, and you look for one of them with a Treasure Breach affix on it. It is still a pretty rare affix to get. You can craft Nightmare Sigils to get it. What you can also do is you can just run Escalation Nightmare Sigils, which is essentially a bunch of dungeons in one, because when it comes to affixes, it's actually a lot more than 3 dungeons. It's actually 6 total dungeons in one, because if you do an Escalation Sigil, when you go into it, that first dungeon will have 1 affix, the next one you go in will have 2, the last one will have 3. All of those affixes in an Escalation dungeon can be a Treasure Breach. That's actually where all of this footage is from. It's from an Escalation Sigil where I got a Treasure Breach as one of them. And what's also really nice is that that's where you can much more easily do this combination, because if you're doing an Escalation Sigil and you're on the 2nd or 3rd dungeon, those will have the multiple affixes. So if you get a Treasure Breach, you can also get it mixed with a shrine buff. So some of the affixes you can get in the game are just have a bunch of a certain type of shrine in there. And this interaction doesn't care what type of shrine it is. You just need any shrine buff active. So if you get that mixture, it can actually be pretty easy to do this interaction. It's just going to be pretty rare. There is also a buff in the middle section of the Nightmare Dungeon tree. So when you're doing an Escalation Sigil and you complete the boss at the end, it will spawn that podium that takes you to the next dungeon and shows you what affixes are in that next dungeon. If you take this middle node, it'll actually spawn 2 more of those podiums that just give you a lot more choices. So if you're actually fishing for this, you can take that node, take the shrine node that you need to do the interaction, and this will just multiply the amount of chances you have at getting a Treasure Breach. I definitely want to do some testing with that middle node because I really haven't used it yet, but if you really want to do that, you really want to get this interaction and fish for through Escalation Nightmare Dungeons, you can definitely take that, and that will just multiply your chances of getting a Treasure Breach. But that's pretty much the entirety of this interaction. It's going to be somewhat rare, but again, if you get a Treasure Breach Nightmare Sigil, especially if it's in an Escalation dungeon, you may actually have a better chance than you think at doing this interaction. Because keep in mind, I've had this interaction I think 4 times now. It is pretty crazy once you get into Treasure Breaches what you can actually do with this, because realistically all you need to do is try to not pull any goblins and look for a shrine buff somewhere. This will work with other goblins. It just isn't going to have like the multiplying splitting, but you can still double any goblin in a Nightmare Dungeon if you can get a shrine buff before killing it. This just allows you to multiply your goblins by a ridiculous amount. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.